May I speak in the name of the God who is love, revealed to us as our Creator, Redeemer and Inspirer. Amen.
Amen.
It's not every church you have competitions to read the Gospel.
I can see her in my office later.
Yeah. Who do you say I am? Was Jesus born to live or born to die? It was during lockdown, and two of my children thought it would be good for me to help with the RE teaching of my grandchildren. One of them, Rudy, was in his last year at primary school, and we started with Hinduism. And I had to remember what I'd learnt in the last year of my theological training in India. But his next project was to answer the question, why did Jesus die? 5 weeks on this, an hour a week. And early on, Rudy asked me, Grandpa, did Jesus know he was going to die? And my simple answer was, not at first. But over the weeks, I shared a bit more of what I meant. I described how Jesus was born in a stable, grew up, worked for many years as a carpenter, what we would call a jobbing builder, working mainly in stone. He then felt called by God to leave his home, leave his family, and to go and preach to his contemporaries. Preach about God's kingdom, to show them something about God's healing, and able to experience something of God's forgiveness, God's love, and God's peace. Shalom in the Hebrew. And I tried to share this with Rudy in bite-sized chunks. And 3 years on, we are still talking by Zoom most weeks about what matters to him, and I try to continue his religious and political education. His other grandfather, no longer with us, was a Marxist, so I try and move Rudy slightly to the right. We will speak at 6. As I washed my hands at the 8 o'clock, I couldn't help reflecting Rudy's got COVID, so I washed them, but he and I will talk tonight at 6. I shared about Jesus' education. I did not mention homework at this point. How every evening after work, Jesus and his friends would gather what was called habarim, the groups of lay people, and they would study the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And here they learnt about the rabbinic style of learning and teaching. And I think I've only really clocked this more recently, I think. Jesus was 30. His father almost certainly dead. He was the eldest son and the chief breadwinner. And then suddenly to feel called by God to leave home and family and become a wandering preacher, you can't help wondering, what did his mother, what did his family make of his decision? What did the neighbours say, for heaven's sake? What did the villagers make of it? You can understand why later, not long after, his family thought he was having a breakdown. But to come back to Rudy's question, did Jesus know he was going to die? My reply, not at first. This is simply my understanding. Jesus believed he was called to proclaim the breaking into history of God's kingdom. God's long-promised arrival to save his people, Israel. All his parables, aren't they, are all about the coming of the kingdom. Almost all of them are about people's working lives. I often wonder how much does our preaching reflect Jesus' focus. He was God's messenger, in some way God's agent. Did he see himself as God's Messiah straight away? I wonder. But he must have hoped, prayed for, expected even, that people would respond. I've always been moved by my recovering alcoholic friend who believes that Jesus was like him. He had to live one day at a time. I believe Jesus had to discover God's will for him one day at a time, as in a sense, so do we all. Then we come to today's reading. Jesus had taken the disciples to the most northern part of the... How many of you know the Holy Land? And you will know this, right in the north of the Galilee to the source of the River Jordan, away from anywhere. No reporters, no crowds. And by now, Jesus knew he was both popular and unpopular. In Luke's early account, we read the details of how he is thrown out of his home synagogue for preaching what I call his woke sermon. The word woke, of course, comes from America, and it came from a description of those who'd woken up to the facts of racial segregation and racial discrimination. And Jesus goes round the edge of the society of his day, inviting into God's kingdom all those who were seen as outsiders in those days. Women and children, the sick, the disabled, the lepers, the Samaritans, the foreigners. His sermon, if you like, was too woke, too inclusive, too challenging for his home village. I mean, after all, how dare a local boy say these things to us? And they even, of course, tried to kill him. Jesus knew by now he was both popular and unpopular. He knew by now the religious authorities of his day felt threatened by his radical and demanding preaching. A working-class boy from a northern village challenging people who felt they had given a lifetime of service to the scriptures. By now, the zealots began to realize this was not their man to lead a revolt against the Romans. So now he asks his closest friends, "Who do you say I am?" He is alone, at one sense, now among his friends. And Peter, forever enthusiastic, responds enthusiastically, "You are the Messiah." By now, Jesus knew that his hopes of, in our language, converting people across the Galilee and across his nation, they were getting a mixed response. His hopes at one level were now uncertain. He knew now whatever happened, his future might be uncertain. By now he'd begun to realize that his mission was far more dangerous than he'd realized hitherto. And from then on, of course, he begins to prepare his friends for what he thinks may happen. He knew, of course, what had happened in the past to those who challenged the authorities. He sensed, if you like, he had been born to live, but now perhaps he'd been called to suffer and to die. And in Mark's gospel, whenever the disciples seem to be blind to who Jesus is, they can't cope with what he's saying, then Mark places the story of a blind person who recognizes who Jesus is and his destiny. The sighted are often blind, and the blind sighted. That is how Mark tells this story. Jesus knew, really, that his disciples could never take on board what he was saying. How many, if any, were with him at the foot of the cross? It was his stoic, loyal women, not the chosen men, who stayed with him till he died. In a way, this is a story easy to tell. We know the extraordinary ending, But it is, I think, incredibly difficult to really imagine. We know that all the other founders of world faiths lived to a great age and died peacefully. Perhaps one, except Gandhi, but he was very old when he got shot. Only Jesus, after less than 3 years' ministry, was killed. It's a very brief meteor in history. But this man from an obscure village on the very rim of the Roman Empire has changed the course of world history. And once more, hesitantly, we come this morning so that he might continue, as it were, to touch and change our lives. As I tried to share with Rudy, he was both born to live, but called to die. And what does his death mean for us today? That's for next week. What does the crucifixion mean for us and our world? But for now, we give thanks for our living, reigning Lord. Amen.